Hi guys, I don't know if I've made it clear in the past, but I'm a passionate supporter of the NHS. I've said both in videos and in live streams that the role of government must primarily be to provide education and health to its citizens. If it isn't capable of that, then it has failed as a government. But public health and public education need not just defence, but they need to be promoted. The alternative is a two-tier society, where people who pay get both, and those who can't are left to fend for themselves. In the Tories, you have the party of privatisation. Labour should be the opposite. So I was disheartened to hear this.
Headline yesterday that you woke up to. You don't often see these words in the same sentence. Labour vows war on health unions. And I would argue quite a brave stance taken by Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, someone who appears quite regularly on this programme. And he puts far more eloquently than I ever could that we need to realise the NHS, and now I will use his words, is a service, not a shrine. And he goes further. It needs to, quoting again, reform or die. Alleluia. At last someone's saying, by the way, he's not pushing for privatisation before we think he's gone raving mad, but at last someone's saying, an organisation to which we give £3 billion a week, actually north of £3 billion a week, you're not going to necessarily make it any better just by giving it more money.
Okay. I'm very disappointed with Wes Streeting here, because he's supposed to be the Shadow Health Secretary. He's supposed to be holding the Tories to account here. And obviously the Tories have underfunded the healthcare system, the NHS, over the last 12 years. And he seems to be attacking the healthcare system, not those who have underfunded it. Now, what am I talking about underfunding? Well, in its budgets, it has to pay higher wages. So the nurses and doctors who've been threatening strike action or on strike, the pay increases that have been imposed by the government come out of existing NHS budgets. There's no extra money to cover the rise in wages. So that's one problem. Because of Brexit and because of COVID, the NHS is lacking staff. So in order to fill the gaps, whatever gaps it can fill, in some cases it's paying private contractors to come in and do the work. And they're paying, of course, that's coming out of existing budgets. So that's eating into the budget. Pay increases are eating into the budget. And of course, inflation is eating into the budget because everything is more expensive than it was a year ago. Nick Ferrari should not be saying £3 billion a week to the NHS. He should be asking, is £3 billion a week to the NHS enough? Because obviously it's not. Once again, he's talking like a Tory. £3 billion. Yeah, but is it enough? Obviously it's not enough because the NHS is on its knees. Now, the focus will always be, well, it needs to be reformed, or as Wes Streeting said, it needs to reform or die. What do you mean by reform? Because when we generally talk about reform of public services, we tend to talk about privatisation. Well, bringing in, and Wes Streeting has mentioned in the past about using the private sector to help clear the backlogs. Now, when the backlogs are cleared, let's play devil's advocate for a moment. When the backlogs are cleared, will the private sector be sent on its way? Or will it be a case of, well, the private sector did a really good job here, maybe we can expand it? Now, just think about it for a moment. When it comes to public transport is a service, and I'm not going into this rhetoric about shrine, it's a service for citizens. Public transport should operate not on a profit basis. The private sector, of course, operates on a private basis. So there will be cases where, for example, a village out in the middle of nowhere and some elderly people need to use a bus service to get into the big city. If that's not profitable, the private sector will not facilitate it. But the public sector should facilitate it because it's a service to citizens. It's paid through taxes. And the same should be applied to the NHS. Because if it's not, then you're going to have a two-tier system. You're going to have people who can pay, jumping the queue, and everyone else is left behind. waiting around. You know, you already sort of have it with the Prime Minister, part of an organisation or a business that pays £250 a month to avoid queues. The Prime Minister. So once again, I'm really disappointed with Wes Streeting here. He should be calling out the real problem here, the lack of funding, the lack of staff. Why is there a lack of staff? Because the existing staff are overworked and underpaid. How can you blame the NHS if nurses have to rely on food banks? It's not the NHS's fault. It's the government's fault. Now, is this part of this strategy to win over racists and bigots in the Red Wall? Is this Keir Starmer's attempt to move more to the right, to pick up a few marginal seats? Maybe it is, but at what cost? Look, don't get me wrong, it's much better to have a Labour government in power than the Conservatives. But once again, at what cost? If I'm exaggerating, if I'm being overly cynical, please tell me in the comment section, because I hope I am, because I'm extremely concerned. I feel concerned about this. The NHS is something that deserves to be protected. It has served its citizens well. You know, when the opinion polls started to drop, when it came to the level of service of the NHS, where people started to turn on the NHS, when the Tories took over, support for the NHS under a Labour government was high. When the Tories took over and started defunding it, started cutting back, involving the private sector, and following the pandemic, support for the NHS has collapsed because of the Tories. And that needs to be called out by the Labour government, by a Labour party, and a Labour shadow secretary. You know, I'm almost going to the stage of calling this disgraceful, because this is... nurses and doctors, nurses are on strike, doctors are planning strike action, balloting for strike action as well, because they can't survive on the wages they're on, and they're seeing the system that they want to be part of collapsing around them. The Tories promised 40 new hospitals. Where are these hospitals? Boris Johnson and the Brexiteers promised £350 million a week for the NHS. This money has not arrived. Why is there no calling out of that crap instead of attacking trade unions instead? The Labour Party should be attacking the government, not the unions. The unions are legitimate in their strike action. They want to protect their patients. They want to protect their members because they're struggling to pay their bills and feed their families. This cost of living crisis is affecting NHS staff as well. I'm really disappointed with the Labour shadow minister here. He should be, as I said, attacking the government, not the workers. But once again, if I'm wrong, please tell me in the comment section, guys.